Hello and welcome to the EchoChamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and today we're talking new politics or coalitions of the willing, or what? Anyway, we'll work it out as we get there. As usual, and despite rumours of his demise, I'm joined by my co-host Martin McMahon.
Oh, they buried me more times, Tony. I'm still here.
You spent all week. Had an MRI for the folks. He had an MRI. He spent all week on Twitter looking for sympathy.
Oh yeah, one tweet.
One tweet. Oh, I'm having nightmares.
I do have nightmares. I'm in here and face you.
Much more importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the tortoise shack by Sinn Fein TD, Public Accounts Committee member, and his party spokesperson on Brexit, David Cullinane. David, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
No problem.
I'm going to kick straight in on I saw you had D. Forbes Morty in front of the PAC recently, and we know Philip Boucher-Hayes had done an excellent expose on the blight of bogus self-employment, and we know that the RT have instituted their own investigation into whether the practices in their own workplace are affected by this. But what no one really says, and I'd like to say it out loud here on air, is that we've a government that are boasting that unemployment rates are 5.8% now. We're saying that we're pre-crash levels. We're at the highest number of people at work in the history of the state, and yet we're constantly chasing behind in terms of the income tax target. Doesn't make sense. What's your idea behind that? What do you see of that?
I'll talk about that just in 1 second. But first of all, Martin looks great. I'm not sure about you, Tony. I'm not sure which one to say. That's all I'll say.
I'm mentally unwell.
Yes, that's true.
But listen, I think the issue of bogus self-employment and precarious work is becoming a much bigger issue than it was 10, 15 years ago. And we can see it not just in the media, we see it in lots of areas where people are paid very low incomes and on what are called if and when contracts. But more and more we're seeing people being employed not as employees but as basically contractors, and we have employers who are purchasing their service rather than these people being employees. And the difficulty with that is that most of these people want to be full-time employees. Mm-hmm. They're doing exactly the same job as many of their colleagues. For example, you mentioned RTE. About 1/4 of all RTE staff are now on these contract employments and what is bogus self-employment. And the consequence for them is, one, they have no choice. They're being told this is the only contract available to you. And if you don't accept it, you don't have a job. So that isn't somebody who is making a choice. I want a flexible contract. I want an if and when contract, or I want to be self-employed. The difficulty with those then who are forced into it is that they don't have trade union rights. They don't have the same workers' rights, entitlements to sick pay, for example, holiday pay, and all of those entitlements are not given to them. So there's an unfair situation where you have a two-tier workforce. You have those who are employed directly, who are being treated more fairly than those who are being hired indirectly and as contractors. And it's becoming the norm now in many different sectors. We see it in construction, we see it in retail, we're seeing it in the media, and we also see it not just in terms of the contract work, but also if and when contracts. So we see people on 10-hour, 15, 20-hour a week contracts, often doing more, doing 30 and 40 hours a week, and they're effectively full-time, but their contracts say that they're only working 10, 15 hours a week, which means they don't have the same entitlements. So it's basically a manoeuvre by some employers and unscrupulous employers to bypass employment rights, and to ensure that when they employ people, they can do it cheaper because they don't pay the same employers PRSI, and they don't have the same obligations to their workforce. And I don't think that's right. I think it needs to be overhauled. It needs to be dealt with. And it's one thing that people want flexible work, but for those who don't and are forced into it, it's wrong.
Well, I know myself, I've been at this quite a long time on the bogus self-employment, and I have gone through the scope section, both with construction workers, with couriers, and we have another case in there at the moment, which thankfully Scope ruled on 2 weeks ago that this person was not an employee or was not self-employed and should have been an employee going back 5 or 6 years. So this is very common practice. I mean, the Construction Federation industry works off the ERCT contract, and the ERCT contract just labels everybody as self-employed without any input from the worker themselves. They get no choice in this. They're simply told they are. And I had, there was a dozen, actually 14 guys we had this time 12 months ago, and we took them through scope, and they got the decision that they were all employees. But as soon as they hit that social welfare appeals office, the decisions are overturned, and the decisions are overturned without any new evidence, without any reference to what it actually means to be an employee or self-employed. They are simply under instructions to force the employee to the High Court to overturn bogus self-employment, which means it's never going to happen. It's prohibitive for any employee to try and go to the High Court. So I've put in the report to Regina, which is 13,500 words, and I was talking to Regina a couple of weeks ago, and she said they're doing stuff in there and they're going to talk. But to me, it's social welfare fraud, and people will argue that it's not social welfare fraud, but it actually is social welfare fraud to deliberately misclassify people as self-employed. It carries a 13,000 euro fine and 3 years in jail. Yet there's no enforcement. The problem is not that the laws don't exist. The problem is that the enforcement doesn't exist. So there is a huge amount of money going to begging, going to companies' bottom lines that should actually be going into the PRSI fund. And when we're talking about pensions being pushed up to 68, that's what's happening, is the PRSI fund is being robbed. And there's nobody better to rob the pension fund than employers. Nobody better.
The problem, Tony, is I and you would see it as fraud because, as you said, if you're classifying these workers' PRSI contributions based on them being self-employed rather than direct employees, there's a loss to the exchequer. And that's costing the taxpayers money, and it means we have less money then for public services. The difficulty is that this is legal and because it's allowed, and the only way we're going to resolve this is that we change the law to prevent exploitation in this area. And the difficulty is that there are obviously some people who want flexible work. There are some people where it suits them to do 5 hours or 10 hours and they get a contract for that service, or they're employed for a specific project and they're employed on that basis and it's a contract. What's happening is that employers are using that flexibility that suits some workers to maneuver a situation where they don't pay the proper PRSI contributions and they don't have to give the same entitlements to the workforce in terms of their holiday pay and sick pay. And what the government need to do is to recognise that there is exploitation happening. They have a responsibility to stop it. We brought forward several pieces of legislation in the Dáil to strengthen workers' rights in a whole range of areas, most of which have been knocked back by the government. So the question is, and I'm delighted you met the Minister and you had a very good discussion, but the government haven't shown any real intention to deal with this in a real way. And I think the problem is, I would see it as wrong, most people would see it as wrong, and indeed those workers who are forced into taking these contracts would see it as wrong. But it's not illegal, and once employers are legally entitled to operate in this way, they will. So our job is to legislate, and our job is to make sure that that level of exploitation is not allowed, and that's what we need to do. We have to do our job.
Well, I looked at bogus self-employment. There's a couple of different strands in bogus self-employment. You have the small guy who's just putting 2 guys off the books, and that happens. You get that. But then there is the more organised end, which we call gigification, which would be the ERCT, the courier contract, all of these things that exist. And I know there's a fine line between whether legal or illegal. And the point here is, if they are found, like this case we have 2 weeks ago, where we have one person who was found to be an employee going back 5 or 6 years, then a demand notice issues from the Department of Social Welfare. And it's up to the employer to pay back everything they owe. Now, it becomes illegal when they can't pay what they should pay. Now, if you take this over, depending on which figure you take, up to 100,000 people on the ERCT system, if you issue demand notices on all of them, they can't pay back what they owe. They can't, over 20, 30 years, they can't pay back what they owe. So the problem is that these demand notices are not being honoured. The department is not sending out demand notice saying, okay, you owe us money, pay us. They're not doing it. They're simply kicking it into the Social Welfare Appeals Office, who are under instruction from a meeting in 2000 to say, no, kick the employee into the High Court. Always rule with the employer. Always rule with the employer. And that's what's happening in the Social Welfare Appeals Office.
And it probably is, and it's no surprise to me that that would be a diktat from those in authority that, let's side with the employer over the employee.
Always, yeah.
I think you're right in everything you've said. The difficulty is still that this is allowed to happen. So, Martin, the only way to solve this is to close all the loopholes, the legal loopholes which are there that allow employers to put people on these contracts in the first place. What happens when they're on the contracts, and if any of the companies are exposed, or if there's any difficulty for the workers and they go through Workplace Relations Commission, or whether they go through directly to social protection and how it's dealt with, that's when trying to bolt the stable door when the horse is gone. We have a job to do to legislate to prevent this from happening in the first place. And I think there is responsibility on all parties and politicians to make sure that workers are properly protected, that there is not loopholes in the system that allow for some unscrupulous employers, the vast majority of which are not, but for those who are unscrupulous and will take opportunities to exploit loopholes, that those loopholes should be closed. And I see that as my job as a legislator, and I've said this to Regina Doherty, and I've said it to Leo Varadkar as well. Sinn Féin will fully support the government in bringing forward legislation if that's what they want to do, and bringing forward ourselves if they want to resolve this issue, and we will work with all parties to make sure it happens.
We're going to change the subject a little and move on a little. We're talking Northern Ireland, and after the referendum we've had here, that Northern Ireland is next seems to be the catchphrase that's going at the moment.
Now for NI.
Yeah, now for NI. And both of us have discussed it. We think it's a great way if you had people from the south going up and working with people from the north and going door to door, as happened here. It's a great way of getting the communities to work together. And it might be the impetus that changes things up north. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I think it's fair to say, first of all, that politics is changing. And politics is changing fundamentally, not just in Ireland, but we can see it around the world. And I think there is an undeniable demand from people who are ahead of the politicians on most of these issues for a proper rights-based society. So on the issue of abortion in the South, and I think Claire Daly nailed it in the Dáil 2 weeks ago when she gave a very powerful speech when she said that the people led and the politicians followed.
Yeah.
And the same is now happening in the North, where the people are demanding. I was very taken on referendum day in Dublin Castle, where the people themselves said the North is next. Because they recognised that we cannot have a situation where we now are going to, quite rightly, put protections in place to ensure that vulnerable women who are victims of rape or incest, and we've had situations, the X case and A, B and C case in this state and many more, where very young women were raped, victims of very violent sexual crimes end up being pregnant and don't have the full range of opportunities that they should have, including a termination if that's what they want in this state. Whether you're orange or green, I think that people in the North will want the same entitlements. And I think that's where the DUP and some of those unionist politicians who are more fundamentalist on this might be caught by the people. So I think that the demand from change has to come from the people, from the ground up, and it's happening. And I think that opens up all sorts of possibilities. Obviously, as a Republican, I want to see a united Ireland, but I want to see a rights-based society. I want to see the same rights, marriage equality, for example, doesn't threaten anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, for those who said that marriage equality was going to be a disaster in this state, it hasn't. The sky hasn't fallen in and was never going to fall in, because it was two people who loved each other who wanted to get married. But we still have politicians in the North, unionist politicians, and mainly the DUP, who don't want even to bring in marriage legislation. So these simple demands, which are about equality, will happen at some point in the North. And I don't think it will be the politicians that will lead. We'll give leadership in Sinn Féin, but by and large, I think it will be the people again. And it's, I think the Taoiseach said it was a
quiet revolution.
I think it's going to get a bit louder because there's lots of issues. And I saw it myself. There was something really profound happening during the recent referendum where young women were coming out in droves on the canvas. Young women were really motivated to come out because they live and have lived, and women have lived in a patriarchal system and a patriarchal society for far too long. And we can, as three men, maybe can empathise with them and we can support them, but we'll never understand what it was like for a woman to face discrimination in the workplace, not to have the same pay, for example, doing the same work, the way women were treated 40, 50 years ago or less when they were pregnant, had to give up their job.
Civil service.
The civil service. Yeah. They populate by far, they make up the ranks of the vast majority of the low paid And all the issues where women, we saw it with the cervical cancer scandal, where women are treated unequally by the state, the Magdalene laundries, the mother and baby homes, all of that. Women are not going to tolerate that anymore. They're standing up for their rights. They want equality and they deserve equality.
Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it
Absolutely.
great?
And that's and we should encourage that. And as men especially, we have a responsibility, because in any of these struggles, whether if it was the civil rights movement in the US or the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, people who are protecting a system which is based on privilege see that, and the same in the North with unionists, where they fear equality because they fear they will lose. But nobody loses. Like, nobody lost when marriage equality was brought in. Nobody will lose if you have equality for everybody. The only losers are those who believe in privilege and elitism. And for those of us who don't, which make up, in my view, the vast majority of the population, North and South, we have nothing to fear. So I think, Martin, you're right that there is profound change, but I think it's going to come from the people. And I don't think it's going to stop in this state. I think people are going to move on to all sorts of other issues as well that they see as important to them.
There's a really interesting point though, because we go back to the tropes, you know, when they said all of these people who voted for marriage equality, they will never vote again. All of these people who've now registered and voted for the referendum to repeal the 8th, they'll all go away. It was 170,000 new people joined the register to vote. Now, they're not going away, no matter what people think. That's not going away, and that leads me to the other trope that exists in the media commonly, where they say Sinn Fein polled at 23%, but they never vote like that in a general election. They said Corbyn would never get those numbers that he was polling at, and like him or loathe him, they said Macron couldn't form a party within 18 months and take over the government in France. The media are even behind the social trend and how these things are going. Mary Lou has come out of this with a lot of credit. She's actually taken this campaign, grabbed it by the neck, to be fair, and she's been one of the strongest performers, whether it be on the canvas or on the debates. How do you feel the direction of the party is going now? Do you feel that there's a zeitgeist change, or the perception after the referendum is changed of Sinn Féin?
Well, obviously, as a member of Sinn Féin, I think Sinn Féin is in a very good place. And people will say, well, you would say that, obviously, as one of the TDs for the party. But I think anybody objectively looking at Irish politics would see that things are changing, maybe slower than I would hope and many people would hope, but there has been real profound change in elections in the last 20 years. 30 years ago, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael had over 90% of the vote between them. And with every election, that's going down. And in the last election, the best that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two Civil War parties, could get was just over 50%.
Yeah, barely over 50, yeah.
So that was a real profound change. The difficulty is trying to then mobilise those who don't vote. Because if those people who don't vote, and all of those people who came onto the register to vote in the referendums, if they voted in a general election, they would actually change the dynamic of Irish politics irreversibly.
I am right in saying that there's more people that don't vote in the last general election than voted for all the parties combined.
If you take into account that there's probably about 40% of the population who are not registered, and then for those who are registered, if there's a turnout of 60%, then it'd be less than half the population would actually have voted. And that's obviously a difficulty, which is my point. If we can mobilise those people who don't vote, and maybe if they can take inspiration from these referendums, that actually if we exercise our vote, we can bring about change, that will happen.
Well, I think it even goes back further than the referendums. I think the politicisation of people started with water, and that the water, marriage and abortion referendums, that's a continuum of people becoming mobilised, seeing that they can actually make a difference themselves, that you don't have to be relying on legislation to change anything. You can actually force the hand of the politician. Again, it's political parties are following the people. I think there's more and more of that. And whether people like to call that populist, but it's not populist, it's just engaged. That's what it is.
Well, that's exactly it. And the people have to be a check on the politicians.
Yeah.
And the politicians, if they feel pressure from the people, will act. And some people would say that's populist. But on many issues it isn't. It's, if you take the housing issue, for example, you took water charges as another example. There was a popular uprising against water charges, but everybody accepted, even the government, that it was more than about water.
Yes.
This was people saying that we've had enough of the austerity. It was on the back of many tough budgets where the people who created the problem in the first place, there was a perception that they got away scot-free and were being protected and bailed out, and those then who benefited least from the Celtic Tiger were the ones who were paying the price: lone parents, people on welfare, people in low-paid jobs, people on middle incomes who were really struggling to get by as well, and people were saying enough is enough. So obviously that's there, and that's still there. There's still a resonance of that. But to go back to the point about the real change and where Sinn Fein is at, I think Sinn Fein will do very well in the next election, and their ambition is to be in government, because I want obviously to be in government. I want to see a Sinn Fein Minister for Housing, for example, because I think that Owen O'Brien, who's our housing spokesperson, would do a better job than
He's not bad, that fella.
Yeah, he's not bad at all. We like Owen.
I like him as well.
Yeah.
And I've very often actually people would say to me, "You were very good on the telly last night," and maybe vice versa to him. But I would prefer to see Louise O'Reilly, for example, as our
Louise is a force to be reckoned with.
But she understands the difficulties in our healthcare system, and more than that, she wants to bring about she wants equality. She wants to see a health service, as I do, as Sinn Féin does, where people are treated on the basis of their healthcare need and not on how much money you have in your pocket. The difficulty then as well, on what basis do we go into government?
Well,
and I don't see it as my job to breathe life into civil war politics. I don't see it as my life to keep my job to keep Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael afloat. I'm with all of those people who came out in big numbers in all of these referendums that we've seen in recent times, including the water charges campaign and many other campaigns, housing action campaigns I've been part of who want real change. I'm in that camp. That's what I want to see. And if any of those parties want to bring about that type of transformative change, yes, we'll work with them. But if they don't, then we have to look to the rest. And others who claim to be on the left and claim to be progressive, many of whom won't work with Sinn Féin either. We have to get our act together. None of us in this state have ever lived in a government, in a state where the government has not been led by either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael.
Yeah, and I agree
And that is absolutely
that.
phenomenal. That never in the history of the state have we had a government not led by any of these two parties. So what's our ambition? To lead a government. And I don't think that's a lofty ideal. I think it's a possibility. We'll have the Mary Lou factor, as has been said. I think she will do very well in the debate. She'll do very well in shaping a vision for Ireland that I hope more and more people will buy into. And we have a newer generation now of leaders, of TDs, of senators, of councillors coming through the party that I believe will give the party a lift as well. And obviously then we have to give leadership. We have to put our vision out there and hope people follow. But what we won't do and what we don't want to be is just another party that acts as a crutch for any of these two conservative parties and everything stays the same. Because I think that would be a real failure of politics if that was to happen. That's not our ambition. It's not where we want to be.
Well, we are in a slow bicycle race to an election at the present moment in time. We're heading that way, whether it comes immediately after the summer or after the budget, whatever way it comes. And I've seen Mary Lou in action now quite a few times. I've gone to quite a few things, and she is very impressive. But there's also other people there in the party that are very impressive. Like Matt, I was talking to you about. Matt is like hugely impressive guy and very good speaker, and that's difficult to get in politics. Somebody who has that sort of
Well, he has a big head as well now. So
Yeah.
And I like that Martin just calls him Matt.
Matt,
You
yeah.
do know it's Matt Carty, folks. Martin just takes liberties with all of these people.
I knew Matt since he was 17 years of age, and I said this off air earlier that we worked together in Ogra in Fein a long time ago, too many years ago to even recall. And he was inspirational then. He was actually the leader of Ogra in Fein at the time. But we have a lot of young people. Matt is one, obviously, and there's a lot of people coming through the party that of real talent, and I've named some of them. But there's no point in us having all of these people of ability and having the policies and having the vision for Ireland if we don't get a chance at some point to implement some of those policies. And that does present a real challenge for the party. And one that's a positive challenge in my view, because why would I want to sit back in the Dáil for the next 5, 10, 20 years and watch Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael carve up the Dáil between them and pretty much carry on with the same policies that have, as I see it, have failed the vast majority of people. And for us to change that, at some point we have to get into government. And I think that's the challenge.
Present a conundrum then for Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin, and I'll use the old phrase, are a party of government, and like to use that phrase themselves. But the conundrum is, to get into governance in Ireland, you've going to have to coalesce with somebody. The way the numbers add up, you're going to have to coalesce with somebody. Now, you get Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael regularly saying, we're not going to go into coalition with Sinn Féin.
That is one of the most pathetic things you can ever hear, that people ruling out listening to the will of the people. Okay, so if the numbers stack up and people said this is how you form a government, for people to be grandstanding now, it's just purely dog whistling, and there's a lot of dog whistling going on.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Tony, because that was what I was going to say. Because we're often accused then of being unfair to some of those parties. I was in a debate recently with Jim O'Callaghan from Fianna Fáil and a representative from Fine Gael, and both of them said that they won't go into government with Sinn Féin after the next election. In the same breath, they say that Fianna Fáil will say Sinn Féin wants to go into government with Fine Gael, and Fine Gael will say Sinn Féin wants to go into government with Fianna Fáil, and it's all nonsense. It's spoofing.
It's dog whistling.
And at the end of the day, the first thing we have to do is have an election.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The people will have their say. We'll see what mandate each party has after the election, and then you make a choice what you want to do with the mandate that you have. If we have a strengthened mandate, what we said is that we will obviously use that mandate to talk to all parties. That means parties on the left as much as it means the bigger parties. And then we will talk to them about forming a government which transforms politics on this island and in this state. And what's the chances of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael signing up to such a programme for government? That's a matter for them. I can't speak for them, but what I can say is that we're at least prepared to sit down and talk to all parties. We're not afraid to talk to them. I believe that those parties, if push comes to shove, would talk to Sinn Féin as well after the election, because I think it is spoofing. Because the alternative, and maybe it isn't a bad one in some ways, but the alternative to Sinn Féin being in government is a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael coalition, or more of the same.
That's not, it's not much different than what we have at the moment, where they're actively in government together, just Lanigan's ball, I step out again, you step in again, and there's a little bit of,
control the opposition.
Yeah, but I think what's more prevalent is actually the tropes again, that the left will eat itself and that you can't trust them, and that I think it was only this weekend that Sinn Féin's economics policy were referred to as kind of North Korea or whatever it was. I won't even dignify the journalist who I read, but anyway, nonetheless, when you see that, and then you know that what we have, we mentioned the housing. I was very lucky to speak to Hugh Brennan from the O'Coolan cooperative, and he can build a three bedroom home for €164,000, and Fine Gael are paying on average $382,000 for a home from a private developer, and they're going to tell us that they built 20,000 homes, 17,000 homes, and they've built none.
So what was it, 300 and something?
But see, you hit on an important point, Tony. There's a responsibility on the media to scrutinise all of this as well and cut through a lot of the spin. And podcasts such as this and maybe the alternative media are doing what some of the mainstream media are not doing. So we have a situation where we have a lot of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael ministers. And a Fine Gael minister recently, when asked about coalition with Sinn Féin, said, their economic policies will ruin the economy. But she's never challenged on, what policies exactly? Because I've done it, and they can't name any of the policies because it's simply a soundbite.
There was an interesting one on that, if you remember, where Michael Noonan, the saviour of the world, was caught with egg in his face because Pierce Doherty pointed out But
I remember in 2007, the general election campaign, and Gerry Adams was seen to have had a poor debate, which I think was overstated. But from that time period onwards, it was Sinn Féin is economically illiterate, and that tag was put on us, and that was a very deliberate strategy by our political opponents, bought hook, line and sinker by the media. And this was in 2007, and then the economy collapsed. And it wasn't Sinn Féin's policies that collapsed the economy. We didn't collapse the Celtic Tiger. The very policies that we warned against are the ones that created the biggest economic crisis that actually hit the state. So there's no proper analysis done. It's the politics of soundbite where these politicians are able to throw out these remarks that Sinn Féin's policies will collapse the economy. No, they would not. What our policies would do is they would continue to build a strong economy, but they would use the wealth that's created to create a fairer society. Our quarrel is not with creating wealth. Nobody's against creating wealth and having a strong economy. The quarrel then is, and the difference we'd have with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, is what you do with it. If you take the last two budgets, for example, they cut the top rate of tax. And yet we have very high levels of poverty, people in low paid jobs, people who can't get access to healthcare, people lying in hospital trolleys, record levels of homelessness, people who can't get childcare. The majority of people I know who work, and I met a guy recently as well that I haven't seen in an awful long time, and I just met him actually in a supermarket, and he said, I'm in a decent enough paid job, but I don't have any money left after I pay the bills. And I don't really have a good quality life, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones.
Yes.
And, that's how people see it, because there isn't fairness in the system and how we distribute wealth. So, I think my point is there was responsibility on those in the media, I think, to challenge some of the lazy narratives, including if we put them forward, of all parties. And I don't think that happens enough. And because of that, then we end up with this nonsense of the Lanigan's ball and who'll go in with who. And we get mesmerised by all of that before people have even cast a vote. And we forget that people are going to cast a vote not based on post-Dáil arithmetic. They're going to cast a vote, I would hope, on what type of society they want. So the debate is shifted away from actual politics.
Give me one leader who steps up and says, I'm going to run in the next general election on a housing platform of tackling homelessness, creating social housing, affordable housing, and protecting the tenuous rental conditions. I won't give a damn about the EU's debt to GDP ratio. I will do what needs to be done to fix this. I think you'll actually galvanise a lot of people who are looking at this. I think it can be almost single issue. I know you want the fair society, but Martin, hang on. If you're telling someone you're gonna say something stupid because that's what you do, but if you're gonna have someone who's paying rent and you know that the rent is $12.50. But you turn around and you say we can work in a way where these are the rental conditions is $12.50, but if you have affordable housing where you can buy a house and it only costs you a mortgage of £900 a month, that money goes back into the economy. Okay, that makes economic sense, and you can do that with affordable housing. You can build homes that a mortgage of that would be €875 at an open market rate. They'd have £300 more in their pocket. That makes that money. Most of that money goes local.
Just before Martin says anything, I think it's amazing that a banker makes so much sense. I think you're in the wrong job.
I'm not welcoming any of them at this stage.
Well, I think with housing, and I'd love to see housing as the ultimate subject for the ultimate issue for the next election. But we haven't seen it. We haven't seen the wave start with housing. There's too many people benefiting from the housing market the way it exists. They feel secure that their place is now out of negative equity. And no other country in the world talks about negative equity except us. I
think what's happening in housing, or what has happened in the last number of years, is that we'll say historically in the past, housing campaigns would have been dominated by the demand for more social housing. And there is no doubt that we need more social housing. The problem is, for those now in the middle classes and the upper middle classes, rising rents has started to affect them. So these are people who can't get a mortgage because they can't save. These are people who are paying in Dublin anything up to $2,000 a month for a modest home to rent, and they can't afford to do it. So because rents have become so high and so unsustainable, it's actually started to hit a different class. And that's now why we're seeing more of a focus. And it's unfortunate because it is a class issue where if this was only affecting those on the lower incomes and on the margins of society, we wouldn't see the same interest in the housing issue. And I think that, Owen O'Brien, we talked about him earlier, is putting the government under real pressure on the housing issue. Every week is coming up with policy solutions. But this isn't complicated. The housing issue is made very complicated by politicians who want to make it complicated. It's an issue of supply where you go back even before the Celtic Tiger. We stopped building public housing, whether it's for rent or whether it's to purchase or whether it's to lease. We stopped doing it. We gave it over to the private sector. We essentially outsourced it, and the vast majority of people's housing needs who are in need of social housing are now having their need met through rent supplement and through RAS and all these schemes. And what does that mean? It drives up the price of rent. Everybody is in the private rented sector, and the state abdicates its responsibility, and they've stopped building, and now we're paying a price for it. And unless we have a complete change in approach, and it has to be a complete change to actually build proper public housing that's a mixed tenure. It isn't just social housing. It's a proper mix. Unless we get back to that, we're going to continue with a housing crisis that unfortunately will get worse.
Well, we do know from the last election that just over 50% of people were bought off with here's your fiver, go buy yourself a latte.
Yeah,
that's what they were
hang
bought
on.
off with.
I'll give you a quick one on the €5 argument. So you can get a €5 cut in this budget, or we could save the state 250 million by not doing it, and that would pay for all the special needs assistance, all the books that you need, all the education, and you wouldn't need to have the schools actually saying we want a voluntary contribution.
Here's the rub, and this is why I get very frustrated at times with the political discourse. In the last election campaign, and you talked about Pierce Doherty catching out Michael Noonan on
the fiscal space.
The fiscal space went over most people's heads. So there was a terminology that people, didn't understand. They understand all the other issues, but fiscal space was something that just became a soundbite.
Turns people off.
And turned people off. But what was real was a promise by the government to abolish the universal social charge. And the only party which had the courage at the time, because it was very difficult, if you're somebody who is paying the universal social charge, as I am, and I pay a hefty amount of USC, and you're being promised this is going to be abolished altogether, it's quite attractive. We had the courage to say it can't be done. You cannot solve the housing crisis and the health crisis and invest in childcare and invest in Gardaí and do all of the things that need to be done and abolish the universal social charge. And what happened after the election? They abandoned abolishing the universal social charge.
Yeah, but that was just but you're populist.
Exactly. And we were being called, which is a point, we were being called populist because we wanted to abolish water charges, which would have cost about €400 million. And they wanted to abolish a tax that would have cost billions of euros.
I think it was at least 2.8 billion.
And hasn't been done. And why? Because it wasn't possible. So again, we were vindicated. But the point is that during the course of an election debate, when it's a couple of weeks and these people can come out and make these type of promises, and sometimes then people can fall into the trap of believing it. And that's why I think I talked about the responsibility on the media. There's also a responsibility on voters to actually cut through a lot of the crap, because you will get crap from politicians in election time. We all know that, and you have to try and cut through it and actually ask yourself, what do all these parties stand for? Do I really believe the promises that are being made? And if you do, then vote for the party that you feel is closest to you and you believe, rather than promises that you may believe won't be delivered.
There was an interesting thing out of the referendum. I had a bit of a back and forward with other people about the poster campaign that the No side generated, and whether things, and people, the Journal and the Irish Times did fact checks on some of the stuff and showed how they're, and then obviously we've seen the media say, under the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland we have balance, and balance was done with a stopwatch rather than with facts. It wasn't fact checked. It was, and then I saw on the flip side, someone said to me, we need to ban referendum posters. And I said, well, the reason you can't ban referendum posters, because if you had the standards applied equally, you wouldn't be allowed to have, and the Kenny's famous one, I will end the crisis of people on trolleys, because then the advertising standards regulator would have said that was actually a false advertisement, because realistically, what we have is as you said, what was Labour said? Wasn't that what you say? The
Pat Rabbit.
Well, that's what you say before an election, was the phrase. I'm bastardising it, but nonetheless, it was something along those lines. And there is that part of that where you have to say to the public now, especially now with social media being so prevalent, Martin likes to call it, social media isn't always social media, it's social memory. Yeah. And people can remember these things, and they'll be able to see what they said and whether they lived up to those promises. And I think now that we're entering this phase where you've got more people who are actually feeling locked out between 18 and 35, actually a locked out generation who, whether it's precarious work or high rents or whatever it is, they feel left out, excluded. You've people put their lives on pause for 10 years. You touched on the vision for the country. I think that's going to be crucial. I think the people who say, what was it, Corbyn, for the many, not the few?
Yeah.
That radicalised people.
That was a great, I think it's a great phrase, because that's captured his politics very well. What I noticed in the last couple of elections is, and mainly from the bigger parties, that they saw the electorate almost as a marketplace. Yeah. And they'll go in and they'll brand and they'll tailor their message to suit what they saw as there's a market for this idea here. The universal social charge is one, there was a number of others as well. And then they'll tailor their message and they'll sell their message and have no real consequence. Listen, if we can't do it, people will forget anyway, we'll move on. And it's simply a matter of getting into government for the sake of it. And, we don't stand for that, and I don't want to be a party that involves themselves in that type of politics. I think there's more to be gained by having a conviction, a strong conviction, having a sense of what type of society you want, being honest with people and upfront with people before an election as to what's possible and what's not possible, as we did during the last election campaign, in a very difficult position where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were both saying abolish the universal social charge, and many other promises, and taxation, by the way, which we didn't think were possible as well. But it's much more difficult to have conviction. But I think that it's what to do, and I think that what Tony is talking about, people are changing, people are becoming more critical. Maybe not enough, maybe not quickly enough. But I think it's happening, and I genuinely believe, given what's happened over the last number of elections, where people have been sold promises which haven't been delivered. I don't know if you remember the Labour advertisement, every little hurts, and it was an attack on Fine Gael's policies. And when you go through them, they implemented every one of them. And trust is also a huge issue. So I think there's two issues.
They didn't actually just make them implement them. They made Labour implement them. They actually fit them. They put them as a mudguard on the front of the bike.
But there's having a vision, okay? And I certainly, and Sinn Féin, we have a vision for the country. And obviously not everybody will buy into it, but we hope more and more people will buy into it. But we have a vision. But there's also the issue of trust. People need to trust the party that they will actually deliver. And you know, what happened when Labour went into government, when the Greens went in, when other parties went in, and even when Fine Gael promised things or Fianna Fáil promised things and we don't deliver, that can erode trust. And I think what we see, and we touched on it earlier with the two recent referendums, is that there's a new, engaged, energised, motivated, young group of people who want real change. And they want to be part of real, substantial, transformative change. And I think we in Sinn Féin have a real opportunity to appeal to those voters that we are the party that, if given the chance, and we want the chance to do it, if given the chance, we will try our best to deal with these issues, and we'll be upfront and honest about what we can achieve and deliver in government, and we will do our best to implement that if given the opportunity.
And I think there was a lesson to be learned, and I mentioned it on Twitter, there was a big lesson to be learned from the last referendum, and even from the marriage referendum beforehand, was Irish people weren't as swayed by money thrown into advertising campaigns as either the Brits or the Americans. And that what actually worked was people on the doorsteps telling their own stories. That groundwork, that you just can't beat that groundwork. It beats all advertising. When you have somebody in front of you, it works a lot better. Now, I know Sinn Féin were very motivated, and I saw lots of Sinn Féin people out actively campaigning for repeal. There were Fine Gael people out actively campaigning for repeal. There were Fianna Fáil people hiding behind doors. And, you know, Labour just not a presence anymore. They're just simply not a presence.
Well, Labour, to give them their credit, were one of the first parties to support us for one of the longest way back. I'll take that, and then we'll stop there.
But they have, the fear has to be for Sinn Féin that if going to be a party of government, that you don't get burned by who we go into coalition. Like Fine Gael have burned everybody who ever went into coalition with them. Whether they wanted to be burned or not, even Fianna Fáil are now burned by Fine Gael. So there has to be that fear within Sinn Féin that if you touch Fine Gael, you're going to end up losing votes. You're just going to end up losing.
What I always say to people internally first, and we'll have our Ardèche in a couple of weeks' time, and there are a number of motions on the Clár to deal with government. And the first thing I say to people if it comes up internally, and the same externally, is that Sinn Féin is not the Labour Party, and nor are we the Greens. So, you know, we have a different outlook, and we're not going to throw away all of the hard work that we've done, all of the gains that we've made for one spin in government, simply to make up the numbers or to get a few ministerial seats.
Martin, talking to you, he wants a American perk.
We don't need any of your mercs and perks, Martin. If you want to give them to us, we'll take them, but we're certainly not going to sell our soul for them. So my point is that that's down to a trust issue as well, and obviously we have to get that across. I don't believe that Sinn Féin is going to go into government prematurely, and I don't believe that Sinn Féin is going to act as a mudguard for either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. But I don't believe that we should be paralysed by fear. And I actually believe that if you approach the government on the basis of fear, and I think that's the worst thing you can do, you're going into government and then you're constantly fearful about whether or not you're going to be punished or whether or not it's going to work. What you need to do is get it right at the start. And you get it right at the start by having a very strong, robust programme for government. Labour Party, before the last election, everybody knew they were going to go into government with Fine Gael. So there was no real negotiation afterwards. And Fine Gael had the upper hand, and Labour simply went along and implemented almost all of Fine Gael's policies and had very little of an identity of their own. And you're right on the abortion issue. They had a very long-standing issue, and we'll give them credit for that, even though Martin didn't. But I think what we need to do is get it right at the start, have a very strong, robust programme for government. And that would put us in a unique position, because what we said is not that we'll tie ourselves to any one party. We said we'll talk to everybody, but that includes the Labour Party. It includes Progressive Independents. It includes People Before Profit and all of those parties. So anybody, and all the other parties as well, if anybody wants to talk to us about forming a government that brings about transformative change, we will talk to them. And we'll put our mandate on the table, we'll put our policies on the table, but the difference between us and some of what would be described as the hard left is that we have a real desire and appetite to be in government, not because we want to be in government for government's sake, but we believe that the people that collectively the left represents deserve to have a government not led by Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. And I think that is a real ambition that Sinn Féin should cherish, should really try and achieve over the next number of years, is to be a lead party in government. And if we can achieve that, I think we can bring about transformative change. And if we don't become a lead party after the next election, we still have a responsibility to talk to parties. And it's up to those parties, at the end of the day, whether or not then they have the appetite or the stomach to actually bring about the type of changes that we want.
You're party's spokesperson for Brexit.
Yeah.
We were looking at this fudge again today, fudge number 217, where they've put in the word clearly and clear. Right? Theresa May is very clear on what she's clearly saying, and which is basically kicking it out by another year is what they're effectively looking to do in terms of come to some sort of deal. What's your sense of where we are?
Well, listen, I think it's a real wake-up call for people in Ireland who say that we should follow Britain and leave the European Union. I'm no fan of the European Union and its institutions, and Sinn Féin isn't a fully signed up member of that club. We know we have a very critical engagement with the European Union, but we've always recognised that staying in the European Union and having the entire island in the European Union is better than coming out, because we're a very small economy and it would be very difficult for us outside the customs union and single market, for example. The problem that we have is that the Tories have no plan whatsoever. Brexit was probably one of the biggest lies ever sold to the British people. They were told that they would have more money to spend on health and public services. They were told essentially that they could have their cake and eat it, that they could have, for all intents and purposes, the customs union and single market and have all of the advantages of that, and then go and negotiate separate trade agreements with third countries. So essentially they were being told by Boris Johnson and Rhys Moggs and people like that, and Michael Gove, that you can be a member of you can not be a member of the golf club. You don't have to pay any of the fees. You don't have to be bound by any of the rules, but you can go and play golf the same as any other member. And it doesn't work like that, and they're being found out. And what we had today was, we were told last December that the government had achieved a backstop arrangement for the North, which would essentially mean that in the event of no deal between Britain and the European Union on trade, the backstop would mean that the entire island would be treated as an internal market, and that the North would essentially stay in the customs union, although not the single market. And that was a degree of progress. That was just cast aside today. All references to the North were written out of the script. In fact, just a line put through where it says Northern Ireland and replaced with the United Kingdom. And what they've essentially done is turned what was a permanent backstop solution into a 1-year extension of the implementation period. And it'll be laughed, I think, out of...
I don't see Michel Barnier coming
by Michel Barnier and by the European negotiating team. And here we are, months away from when we're meant to have a deal, and we're in a crisis. And by the way, we were told by the Taoiseach and by the Taoiseach that June was going to be the key time period. We were going to have real substantial progress. What we needed was the political agreement last December translated into a legal text that we could see. That last December,
we had peace in our time. We literally had the press
cast iron guarantee.
Yeah, but we had the press op. We had the photo op, I should say, of peace in our time, and we all knew that it was a promise to make a promise.
But really. This is a real test, and I think this is a real test for Leo Varadkar, because he came back and said that this was a cast iron guarantee. We were more circumspect, and we said, Don't trust the British in terms of what they put on a piece of paper, in terms of a political promise. Let's see what happens in terms of the substance, because the detail in the substance is more important. We're now seeing that they haven't shown the colour of their money, and they're dragging this out. And the Taoiseach met the British Prime Minister a number of weeks ago. You might remember he came out and said, "Well, there's new thinking. I've been shown and I've been told in confidence what this new thinking was." Is it this piece of paper that we got today? And if it is, it's a complete disaster. So we have supported the government on Brexit, and we recognise that we have to get the best result for Ireland. I hate using that term, put on the green jersey, but I think there was a need for all politicians on the island of Ireland to unite behind the need for a solution for Ireland, because the Tories will look after the Tories. We need to look after ourselves in Ireland.
For the longest time, I've been calling it's the 31st of March, or next year is, and so to wake up April 1st. I've been calling it April Fool's Day. That was my call, that there was not going to be a deal. The deal will hit D-Day, and it'll, now planes won't fall out of the sky and things won't stop, as it won't be. Remember, it'll be actually similar to the Millennium 2K bug that was going to shut down everybody's computers. That won't happen, but you will see. I don't see I don't see the bones of a deal. I don't see the framework of a deal. I don't even see the chalk outline of a deal at this stage.
Well, and one thing is certain, Brexit is something that bores the socks out of a lot of people, including myself, who has to deal with it on a daily basis. But everybody still accepts that it's really profoundly important. And it has the potential to change the political and the economic landscape of this island for decades. I mean, if we have a hard Brexit, and if we have any hardening of the border on the island of Ireland, what people are forgetting, and some British politicians are forgetting, is that the border isn't just about trade. So trade is obviously important, and we need to have a trade solution. But the border was more symbolic than about trade. And the Good Friday Agreement and the conflict resolution and the peace process that we had was all about making sure the border was invisible. It was taking down borders, taking down those barriers, and creating a new dispensation in the north. Anything that flies in the face of that. And one thing is factually correct, politically factually correct, is that Brexit is incompatible with the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
The two are mutually exclusive. So we're in a situation where we don't know whether or not the British government are going to sign up to a process that fully supports the Good Friday Agreement and all the rights issues that are underpinned, for example, people in the north having access to the European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, if they travel abroad, and their health protections, access to education outside of the north, including in the south, and obviously then all of the border issues and the trade issues. It's fundamental. Like, I mean, any hardening of the border will be an absolute disaster. It will. You know the old phrase: the road you seek out to avoid your destiny just brings it closer. There's an awful way where they've sought out with this Brexit to put their stamp on things, and they're only hastening. I think a border poll has hastened it. I never thought I'd be around to see one, but I think I will be. Martin thinks it's going to happen next Thursday. I think it's a few years down the road, but nonetheless, the more positive side.
Well, no, my reasoning behind it is it's the pocket. Yeah. What hits people most is in the pocket, and the first EU farm payments that don't come through to the landed gentry and the landed class up north, which are predominantly on the unionist side, that then it hits home, and your price per acre goes from 10 sterling per acre down to 5 sterling per acre. That hits home really, really hard. These guys aren't stupid. They've spoken to their financial managers. They've spoken to whoever they need to spoke, their bank managers. They know what's coming down the line as soon as Tony called it, April's Fool's Days come. I expect them to preempt it. If it was me and it was my wealth, I preempted. I wouldn't wait for the day I was made.
But there's a real interesting clash now potentially that will happen in the north, which is identity politics versus real politics, and versus where people are at in terms of how this will impact their pocket. And I think that is important. And then all of those social issues that we talked about earlier. So I think there is now a question being asked. It was an opinion poll actually a number of months ago, where people were asked, if the north is taken out of the European Union against its will, and remember, the majority of people voted to stay. If it was taken out against his will, would you then vote for United Ireland? And 49% 58.5% said that they would,
Yeah.
which is huge. It was the first time that there was a near majority on people voting for a United Ireland. And I think what we have to do is create the space in the South, and for those of us, and in the North, and those of us who are Republican and instinctively want a United Ireland, to reach out to those moderate unionists to say that their identity and their rights will be fully respected in a United Ireland. Because Martin McGuinness, for me, was one of the greatest leaders of my generation and someone that I always took inspiration from. And he always said that nationalists and Republicans in a United Ireland will never treat unionists the way nationalists were treated in a partitioned Ireland, in a United Ireland. So Bobby Sands said our revenge will be the laughter of our children. So we can convince a section of unionists that they're better placed to live in a new republic, because any notion that a United Ireland would mean Rome rule is completely gone and is nonsense if you look at what's happening. So all of those issues around marriage equality, abortion rights, all of the other social issues that the Conservatives and fundamentalists and even bigots in the DUP and in some sections of unionist parties as well represent. And I think that there are those in the unionist community that want, like many people in the South, they want to see real change. And if they see those parties that traditionally represented them for decades blocking that progress, and if they see, well, the only way to unblock ourselves from that is United Ireland, there is a possibility, and a real possibility, that more people will see United Ireland as a more attractive opportunity. But that does place a responsibility on those of us who want to see it happen to actually set out our vision. And that's why I can't for the life of me, anytime we've ever asked the Irish government to develop a green paper on Irish unity, which would set out how it would realistically happen and what it would look like, they refuse to do so because it might upset, as they say, the unionists. But like we talked about this beforehand, we're talking about if there is going to be a border poll, it's a referendum.
Yes.
So referendums, yes, they can be divisive. Of course, like we saw it with the abortion, there was people that had different arguments. But you have a referendum, you put forward the different arguments, you should have the courage of your conviction, and we'll certainly in Sinn Fein obviously go out and argue for a United Ireland if there was a border poll. But why not let the people decide? I mean, a referendum is essentially allowing the people to have their say, not the politicians, not any British minister, not a Secretary of State, but the people who live in the North making a decision for themselves. And I don't see how that hurts anybody. I don't see how that offends anybody. I think, yes, it will be challenging in terms of some of the debate, but also give us an opportunity, for those of us who are Republican, to reach out to those unionists to say, your political rights, your cultural rights, that Orange tradition has to be absolutely respected and front and centre and copper fastened in any republic based on rights, that their rights also have to be delivered.
Well, it's the maths of it. If you are, but it is the maths. It's the maths of what's in your pocket.
You don't believe that, Tony?
I just think when we talk about the numbers, I'm much more in a referendum. If you had a referendum, and Martin, we had a row over this.
We had a big argument.
Mr. 51% gets us over the line, and I thought, well, I wouldn't want to stage a 51% coup, for want of another word. You're going to say that's democracy. I'm going to say I'd rather reach out to large parts of people and say...
But you're on the Eamon Dunphy side of the argument there now, which is not a very good place to be, because I had a row with Eamon Dunphy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I was on a show recently where Eamon was making the
No. Come back, John.
And there are some commentators who are making the same argument.
I'm going to talk to you on Mullally.
The difficulty is that Republicans were told for years that if you embrace democratic politics, then a United Ireland can only be achieved through the ballot box and people democratically voting for a United Ireland. And we signed up to the principle of consent, which was a very difficult thing, where not a vote across the entire island, but two concurrent referendums. So there would have to be majority in the south and there would have to be majority in the north.
Yeah.
And we're now hearing from some saying that even if a majority in the north, even if it's 51% vote for United Ireland, oh well, that wouldn't be really conclusive. Doesn't stack up for me, because if you have a referendum and a majority wins, a majority wins. And, you know, can we get to a point where we have 60, 70% in favour of United Ireland? Possibly. And, you know, we're not saying that we want, Martin is even well ahead of Sinn Féin on this, where he's saying in the next 14 months possibly. Like we've said in the lifetime of this assembly, which is in the next 5 years now, the assembly's not up and running. But obviously we wanted as soon as possible to have a debate. And it opens up a debate and gives people an opportunity then to actually decide, do they want to be part of the union with Britain, which we can see now with Brexit and all the challenges that presents, and with a refusal from the DUP to implement the social changes which people want.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want that union, or do you want to be part of something better? And, the biggest thing that we have to get across to people that I'm certainly not for taking the North and taking the South and pegging the two together, and that's what we get. We have an opportunity, if we're going to have a united Ireland, to build a new republic,
Yes,
a new constitution, a new Ireland, and all that goes with that. So it will be absolutely powerful and massive. 102 years on from the 1916 Rising, where we had the proclamation, to have a debate in the next number of years on what type of Ireland we want in the here and the now.
Well,
and look at the promises that were made then, which many of it is timeless, and say, well, what type of Ireland do we want, and what type of republic do we want? And I think that's where the debate will be.
there was a great little picture put up on Twitter recently, and it was the old Jurassic Park gate, and it was Northern Ireland. And it was, instead of Jurassic Park, it was Northern Ireland. And I see that's where Northern Ireland is now. Ireland has very quickly become more progressive than the UK has very quickly moved on. We now look up north and think that's the dark ages up there, where they used to look at us and think that's the dark ages down there. And again, I keep coming back to it. It's the maths of it. If you can be unionist or wealthy, you can be a small voice in a UK Parliament or a big voice in an Irish Parliament. And I think these numbers all stack up. And I don't think the impetus is necessarily going to come from the South. I think it's going to come from those in the North themselves say, well, where are we better off?
And you're right. And I think that what frustrates a lot of people in the North, and I can understand why you use the words you use in terms of the Dark Ages. There is no doubt that there are some politicians that represent the Dark Ages. But remember, on lots of these issues, Brexit, marriage equality, there's a majority of Assembly members that are in favour of change. The difficulty is that we have the cross-community element built into the Good Friday Agreement, where
it's not necessarily
there's not a simple majority. So if the DUP block a piece of legislation, it doesn't go through, and that's one of the difficulties. We were in the most recent talks trying to get them to agree not to use that clause and invoke that clause if necessary. But the vast majority of people who live in the North don't see themselves as living in the Dark Ages. They're very forward, modern thinking. They want the type of society, they want a more modern society, and they want all of these issues dealt with. And I believe a majority of unionists as well as a majority of nationalists. The difficulty is, and this is where you are right, that the political system is failing, and the political system is well behind the politicians in the North. Whatever about in the South, where I think it was the case on the most recent issue that the people were ahead of the politicians. Yes. On so many issues, the people in the North are well ahead of the politicians, and there's a growing sense of frustration. And I did a number of what were called engagements with civic nationalism for Sinn Fein. We went out and we met with hundreds of people, thousands, but we had meetings, hundreds of people attended all of them. I did one in Newry where there was people from the GAA, people from trade unions, people from the Chamber of Commerce, and they were demanding these changes, and they understood where the block was coming from. And the petition of concern is the clause I'm talking about. Well, that was being used to block progress in many of these issues. And I think the same type of demand is now coming from some in the unionist community as well, where they actually want to see the type of changes. So I think the dilemma for those who are progressive and unionist is that do they continue to give absolute blind loyalty and support to the DUP and keep electing them in the big numbers that they do and allowing them to block the type of progress? And is that more important than getting the type of fundamental changes that they want?
Well,
that's an interesting question, and we don't know the answer, but I think that's a question for them, and all we can do is say to them that we will work with politicians from all sides in the North to vote for and to bring about legislation, to bring about changes in the issues where we feel have happened in the South in recent years that need to be applied to the North as well.
Well, there's a whole generation, what we call born frees, who were born free of any of the troubles, who are out there now. They're not as tied into the past as the older generations were, and they seem to be the engine of change up north, and they also seem to be the engine of change down here. So the hope has to be that the born frees lead the way, that they show us that we are better as one island than we are. We're too small to be two parts of one island. We need to
one
be
island less Waterford, if you don't mind.
We've Waterford. We had a bad weekend last Sunday.
Parts of Cork. We don't want that either.
Remember, Waterford is the oldest city in Ireland, and one of the best cities. And by the way, both of you should come down to Waterford and use the Greenway.
Oh yeah. I'll use the Greenway. He could
You could do
it
the exercise.
Yeah.
You drive a motorbike on it.
No, you can't drive a motorbike. It's beautiful, and it's one of those counties that people from Dublin forget about, and then when they come down, they go the beautiful coastline passage, Cheap Point, Dunmore,
I call it the wine cellar. I call it the wine cellar. You forget it's down there, but then there's lots of lovely things down there.
Lost in Wexford. That's what I call it.
You're not coming then. There's no visa for you.
Thank you very much for coming on. It's been a really interesting chat. Hope to do it again, but it has been really interesting. There are developments coming, so we'll probably have to get you back in again on Brexit at some stage as things kick off.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming.
David, appreciate you coming in, and you're right. We are trying to put a different spin on what the media landscape is, and it's by having voices like this and having a long form conversation where I think people get a better feel for what a different type of society and what it might mean, regardless of party politics. Putting that aside, what we want to have as a thing. Listen, folks, I want to thank you all for listening. Click subscribe, click review, tell your friends. I always say it, we rely on you guys. We have no marketing budget. It's literally me and the monkey over there. Thank you.